All right, it's my great pleasure to be joined on the Managing Violence podcast by Dr. Nathan Brooks. Nath, great to chat with you.
Hey Joe, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, look, it's you're a man I've had on my list for a little while. You and I have presented on a couple of webinars together during the COVID years, and I've been aware of some of your work that you've done with a few friends of mine over the last couple of years. So, very excited to meet you properly recently, and also to organise this interview for the benefit of listeners. I think you might be the first Kiwi we've ever had on the show, so that's a dubious distinction.
Well, we better say that carefully. I'm actually an Aussie living in
Are
Kiwi
you?
land.
Oh,
So
really? Oh, I'm
yes,
sorry.
so I'm just posing as a New Zealander at the moment.
Well, I mean, we do tend to claim Kiwis both ways, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I
Um,
know.
okay, well, an Aussie living in New Zealand, close enough. You're the first New Zealand-based guest. We'll run with that. Uh, Mate, just for those that don't know you, can you give us a bit of an idea of what your background is, professionally, academically, etc.?
Yeah, so I'm a forensic psychologist. I'm probably around 13 or 14 years into working in the field now, and started off really working with all different types of offenders from, everyday sort of criminals, burglary type offenders, drug and addiction based issues, through to the more severe and serious folks, such as our sexual offenders, homicide offenders, and then also some pretty complex presentations, particularly around psychopaths and various personality disorders as well. So I spent a lot of my early career doing that. Worked with some high harm, high risk individuals, stints in corrective services, periods lecturing at universities. And then now working in the police sector as well, in the operational psychology space, really basically consulting and advising on major crime investigations.
Yeah, interesting. I think when I first came across you, you were doing some work on psychopathy from a HR point of view, and recognizing signs of psychopathy in potential hires and staff and so on. So I found that really intriguing because it is one of those subjects, and we might even come back to that. I know it's not the topic necessarily of today, but it is one of those areas I think that people generally have a bit of a misconception about, purely because like Hollywood has taken the term psychopath and turned it into something that it probably isn't. So that is quite an interesting topic. Maybe even a whole different podcast. We'll see how we go for time today. So the work that you've done recently has been around lone actor violence, and I know you're writing a book on that at the moment. So that's something we'll touch on. We'll find out more about the book. But when we talk about lone actor violence, yeah, that is a term that sometimes we refer to as lone wolf, although that's probably a little bit too sexy and cool and might be a little bit too attractive. But lone actor violence, what actually is it? Like, what are the parameters for something to be considered lone actor violence?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I like to think of the term lone actor a little bit like the term serial killer. So it's a very broad, sort of all-encompassing term that describes a particular type of offender or a particular type of offending. But within that term, like with, say, serial killer, there can be a lot of variations and different reasons and motivations that are associated with that offending. But in essence, we're really talking about an individual that wants to carry out a mass casualty attack, and they're doing this on their own initiative rather than at the direction of others, such as a group.
So this is someone who's ultimately acting alone. They're not part of a syndicate. What about with terror attacks where the person has maybe committed the attack on their own but have been motivated by ideology? Is that still considered lone actor, or even though it might have been influenced and encouraged or even coerced?
Yeah, I think generally the consensus would be that, these fellows are not, isolated in the classical sense, and we'll probably talk a little bit more around that. They are connecting with others online, and they're engaged in various sort of platforms and learning information, and I guess gaining tactical knowledge and those sorts of skills and understandings. But the attack really is coming out through their own undertaking and their own initiative rather than sort of being at the direction of others. But they may lean on others and talk to others to garner sort of competency and capabilities in carrying that out. But it's essentially their own sort of self-initiated process that gets them to there. And we've moved away. So initially it was talked about as a lone wolf was
Mm,
the term that was used, and that was probably frowned upon because it's sort of sensationalized in many ways the idea of these fellows planning in secrecy and
mm,
being skilled and capable. And they're actually quite rare. The likes
mm,
of
mm,
and Anders Breivik and even Tarrant and some of those individuals are quite rare. They're really outliers in many ways, and most of them are not that well organized, even though they've spent quite a bit of time thinking about the offence. But they don't really sort of plan in secret. They're not doing precautionary sort of counter surveillance type
mm,
measures. That they have quite a distinctive sort of online footprint and a lot of leakage and that sort of thing that's coming through. And there is, yeah, so there's a reasonable trace that they are sort of progressing towards that path of violence, and lone actor has taken over really as the more appropriate term to capture these folks.
mm. Yeah, I think that's something that Matt Thornton just touched on in the last episode, where he was talking about more study of the social violence and criminal violence world, whereas in the gangsters are typically not cool in any way. They're pretty much losers that are making very little money and taking extremely high risk for the sake of it, and pretty usually not that smart. So um and we kind of see that as well with lone actor violence as well. Like if you call it lone wolf, it does tend to attract those that may be feeling insignificant and like they are a bit of a loser and on the fringes of society. And the lone wolf is something that you can romanticize that, you can fetishize that in a way that I'm not part of society. I'm not like you. I'm a whatever, right? And we honestly, 100%, we see this in my community, I guess, in the combatives community, in the self-protection community, people that fetishize violence and being some sort of quasi street soldier, which usually indicates there's something else that's not quite right in their life as well. But yeah, so interesting that we changed that term. Actually, it's very similar to I'm not sure if the same thing happened in New Zealand, but in Australia with the we stopped talking about king hits, like hitting someone from behind, knocking someone out with a blow. We stopped referring to it as king hits and started referring to it as coward punches. And it's an interesting, just a quick change in terminology completely changes the emotional impact of the label, right? It's not a king hit, it's a coward punch. And yeah, that's interesting as well. The same sort of methodology has been used here. Um, so
Yeah.
with our lone actors, but for those that maybe are not familiar with I guess the principles of threat assessment and management, and this is broadly what we're talking about here. That this field of study is threat assessment and management, behavioral threat assessment and management, identifying signs for premeditated violence and hopefully intervening before it eventuates. So the pathway to violence is a model that we pretty much all reference in some way or another. Can you quickly just sort of, for the uninitiated, talk through what the pathway to violence is and how you would look at this from a lone actor violence point of view?
Yeah, I mean there is a general sort of pathway that we see with a lot of these fellows, and it's sort of universal. And I mean, it often sort of starts off with, the grievance, which is quite a sort of, prominent underpinning for many of them, where there's something that goes on in their life, and that sort of creates the foundation for them to progress through that. And from there, we start to see that, various factors then become sort of catalysts for that. They then look at potentially sort of identifying with others, maybe through online means, or develop some sort of violent identification around that, because they're struggling to solve the problems or the issues or the setbacks within their own life, and slowly sort of the options begin to close for them, and violence emerges as a solution. And we see that there then becomes more, psychological sort of resources and time and thinking allocated to that issue, and that can then lead to some research and planning around how an attack might be carried out. And then it progresses from there, where we see that there's a level of sort of preparation that goes on, and then ultimately, as the person sort of progresses up the staircases, which is one of the models that's been talked about, the sort of ascending staircase of narrowing options, where less and less sort of alternatives exist, and violence really starts to emerge as the sole solution or sort of that last resort behavior. They then sort of explore sort of various weaknesses and possibilities around how to carry out the attack, and then ultimately the attack occurs. Now, of course, people can sort of move up and down that pathway of violence, but yeah, as things continue sort of to head in the wrong direction for them, they keep progressing up that pathway, and that gives us a lot of opportunity, of course, to intervene and put prevention plans in place. The challenge is when we miss people that are on that path, and it is really difficult. We're very reliant on information flow and people reporting and getting that information to the right people, because there are a lot of people out there that are on that pathway, and it's just not known until that information gets through to the right people, and then there's the possibility and the options to be able to put some preventions and interventions in place.
Yeah, so you mentioned grievance and fixation a little bit there. So I mean, a grievance, we've all got grievances, right? We've all got times when we're being upset about something. Let's just choose government as an example, right? We've all had a fine we didn't think we deserved, or we've had a knock on the door from a local council or something about set up a gazebo without permit. Like we've had something that you can consider a grievance. At what point does that grievance become just a reasonable grievance and someone's going to grumble and tell their neighbors about, versus a grievance where, like, I've decided I'm going to drive a car through the front door of City Hall?
Yeah, I always think it's how dialed up are the dials for that
Okay.
individual, and at what point does it start to consume their everyday life. They wake up thinking about it, they go to sleep, thinking about that issue as well, and they spend so much time allocating it to that problem. So it really starts to consume them, and it becomes ever increasingly intense for them. And grievances can manifest in many different ways. So we might say that we can have a violent attack that's purely sort of grievance based, or the grievance may drive the person then towards an ideology, or they already have pre-existing sort of ideological beliefs or attitudes, then maybe they're more inclined to get aggrieved. So it can be quite a vicious cycle. And ultimately, what we're saying, around grievances is that really, when we think about it from a lone actor perspective, we're really talking about someone that's engaging in a hostile and violent act in pursuit of means that are of particular significance to them. And it's often underpinned by, that injustice, being victimized, being wronged. And so it's some sort of personal vendetta or grievance that they are then acting on. And we can probably take that then again even a step further, and it really comes back to perception and how they perceive that situation. So a little bit like with your example, most of us can take an objective view of a grievance, but it's the distortion in the perception that's really quite problematic for folks that do move on to carry out an attack. So it really is viewed in some ways as something that's been done to them and ultimately sort of threatened their livelihood and their well-being. And then they feel when they've tried to get solutions, they haven't arisen, and they've been further discriminated against or mistreated. And then that just really perpetuates the cycle. And then, as we're saying, they can then progress further up that sort of pathway of violence. And we're talking about often initially experiences like humiliations, shame, rejection, being ostracized, being victimized. So there's often a significant emotional event that's there for them, and then it gets compounded and layered upon, and it really grows from there, and that's where the problem arises, and that's really where we want to see the prevention put in place, and of course the early identification that this person is progressing that way.
Yeah, you raise a bunch of really interesting points there. The first one that just to narrow in on was the idea of it's the potential offender's perception of what they've tried and how they've been treated. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the government or whoever the target is has done the wrong thing necessarily, or has deliberately ignored them, but it could just be their perception thereof. Especially someone who maybe isn't savvy with the way they should be approaching this. They might think that they've done the right thing because they posted a couple of messages on the target's social media and nothing happened, and therefore I've tried all reasonable options, and like, we're now in unreasonable territory. I didn't know how to submit the petition or to get legal advice or whatever. Maybe that was outside means from either a financial point of view or maybe just a general intelligence point of view. There could be all sorts of limitations there as to why someone hasn't gone through what we'd consider to be the normal channels. Um, the one thing that I've always sort of gone along with as part of, I guess, what when I started studying this was that people are more likely to become violent over fixation on a cause versus fixation on a person. Firstly, have you found that to be true? And secondly, can you explain maybe from your understanding, like why are people more likely to get violent over some sort of bigger cause rather than just a fixation on a person who's wrong with them?
Yeah, we do. Well, so it's interesting. I guess you could look at it more around targeted violence. It's just stepping back from lone actor attacks. So targeted violence, we certainly see that the fixation on the person happens. Lone actor attacks, not so much. So I guess we get the difference within that cohort of offending across targeted violence. So the classic example is, domestic violence and stalking is often heavily person oriented. There's a specific victim, whereas lone actor violence, mass casualty attacks, it can be person oriented, but we often see that, yeah, it's more causal based or a sort of potentially proxy based victim group. So it might be as we've seen with like Anders Breivik and certain individuals, it becomes around you know cultural issues, religion, sort of right-wing beliefs, which then have various sort of cohorts of individuals that fit within that realm or within that ideology. So those that might be opposing the ideology, and then that comes to sort of represent the target group rather than it being one particular person. We do, though, with fixated violence, see that that can be as well targeted, of course, with fixated threat assessment centers and the focus on public figures. That can certainly be quite personal as well. So I think it becomes very mixed. Definitely from a lone actor perspective, though, it has more the lean towards sort of a collective uh, group of individuals that either can be related to some sort of significant meaning to the individual, or alternatively, just represent an opportunity to carry out mass violence. And it doesn't necessarily matter who they're going to kill in the process, just as long as it's a large number of individuals.
Yeah, that's I guess that's the one that tends to almost in a way stay in our psyche where it doesn't appear to be targeted at anybody. It was just a random massive act of violence, and there doesn't appear to be a reason for it. And in a way, I think that tends to cause more fear and unsettle people more because it feels like when you can identify that this person was working on behalf of an ideology that we know has certain targets, and we've kind of wrapped our head around a little bit around that. As much as it's still abhorrent, we can kind of see, okay, we know why that happened in a way. Um, yeah, not to, and I need to be super clear. We're not devaluing any type of attack or saying any one is better or worse than the other. I think just in terms of psyche on the general populace, they have different impacts. Like if we were to compare, for example, the Christchurch mosque shootings, which were obviously very targeted at a certain sector of the New Zealand community, versus the Las Vegas Route 91 Harvest Festival shooting, which seemed to be just wanton mass chaos. But those two are quite different in terms of the psychological impact and perhaps even obviously the motivations of the shooter as well. Although, to my knowledge, we still don't really understand the motivations of the Vegas shooter. Um,
Yeah,
what role? Sorry,
I was
jump
just
in, please.
jump in there. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because we've come a long way probably over the past decade where in some ways we could argue that it's become more and more confusing. So initially we were heavily focused on ideology, and this has been a bit of I guess, a conversation piece across sort of those in the field. Ideology represented a lot of the early stuff, and particularly it was sort of that jihadi focused ideology. And then we sort of moved a little bit more towards the right wing side of things. But that's really become quite confusing now. And so ideology isn't necessarily what it used to be. And probably what it used to be was someone had a distinctive type of ideology and they stuck to that and they didn't change. And then now we've seen that we've got a whole bunch of people coming up with different terms to try and explain ideology because it is so confusing. So we've seen things such as salad bar ideology, grab bag extremism, which is basically, a bunch of cherry-picked things that have some level of meaning to the individual, or they're quite salient and they grab hold of them. And that then becomes, I guess, fuel for their violence. But I think we do need to be cautious in saying that that alone is the motivating or driving factor. And that's why we've seen that lone actor grievance-fueled violence has probably emerged as I guess an overarching term to say that look, there's an element of grievance and fixation that's associated with all these folks, and it just has different layers or different lenses, which then get placed on top of that, and it gets expressed in various different ways. So yes, of course, we still get the ideologically inspired violence, but we now also get a huge amount that doesn't fit neatly into boxes, and that then becomes quite challenging to explain. And I think the field's got to be really careful now that we make sure that we do progress and evolve from that typical ideological thinking to understand that, we're dealing with people, we're dealing with humans. There's some psychological processes at play, and we need to be flexible in how we go about trying to understand this. And it doesn't necessarily nicely fit into boxes, which can be quite challenging for some people to get their heads around.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's such a huge topic there with the role of ideology and motivation and especially in cases where the offender has died as a result of the attack, either by their own hand or by law enforcement. We're always guessing, right? We're looking at writings, we're looking at forensic information and things they've left behind. And sometimes it's very clear, and other times it's really not. And we're left grasping at straws and trying to find a reason. And I think it's probably just the human nature. We like to have reasons for stuff. Like we don't like not know why something happened. Yeah, this the same reason that our distant ancestors would do a sacrifice if there hadn't been rain for a while, right? At least we feel like a little bit of control if we can understand why there's been no rain. But look, I think that's an interesting element from a psychological point of view. So in your, I guess, professional and academic context, what's this might be a really hard question to answer, but the difference between what's going on in someone's mind when they feel like they're a quote unquote freedom fighter, or they're making a political statement they see themselves as the good guy, I guess, that's taking one for the team and gonna enact this mission against the enemy, versus someone who is maybe status seeking. So I'm thinking like a Martin Bryant from Port Arthur, going back to 1996 for those that maybe are too young or maybe on the other side of the world and don't know that name. So the Port Arthur massacre here in Australia that famously led to our gun laws, but that didn't appear to be anything to do with the fixation. That seemed to be completely random. So from a psychological point of view, is there a significant difference that you notice in those sort of offenders?
Yeah, it's a difficult one to answer. Yeah, some there's a stronger identification with a cause, as you pointed out, and then others it's more sort of personal and psychological factors that lead to that. I guess as we go on, there's some aspects that I'll probably talk more about around, why some of this violence is taking place. But I've recently worked on a paper with Christopher Ebrecht from Denmark, and we tried to untangle the issues around motivation. And at a psychological level, what what we've sort of argued is that people have essential needs, essential psychological needs that they require in their life. So, we all want to sort of have a sense of belonging. We all want to fit in. We need a degree of significance where we feel like we matter, a level of autonomy, to be able to make free choices, to foster our own sort of sense of identity. We need certainty, so predictability within our lives. And also we're all very much driven towards love as well, and that connection. Hollywood's made a whole industry out of love and romantic movies. So we've got those driving factors that really influence our behavior and sort of I guess deep hardwired needs that we're motivated for. So it becomes very interesting then when people can't fulfill those, or those needs get threatened or thwarted. And that's where, when we look at cases, internationally, that when this happens, people find some very unusual and maladaptive ways to then go about meeting these needs. And in some ways, it moves from a cycle of, initially they might think it's them, it's issues with other people. It then might move to it's me. They start to internalize the problem. And then it shifts to its life, where we sort of see them fall into this mindset around, it's just general humanity. And there's something, deeply flawed and fundamentally problematic about people and society. And then that mindset can emerge, and it can become personal for the individual, or it can take that ideological lean. And we see that they then can move towards violence, sort of as a way to resolve or to maintain some sort of salvation of those psychological needs. So, for example, when someone loses sort of that final sense of control in their lives, we might see that tipping point arises, and violence then becomes that sort of last resort option, a final way to, push back against their sort of needs being threatened. And it might bring them, even though, it may end their life, it might be a way to finally matter, to finally bring an element of significance to their life. Even though they may die, but it gives them that opportunity to sort of live on posthumously, and their name will be remembered with that attack. So really the role of these psychological needs, we think, is quite significant in sort of driving behavior. And when they get thwarted and threatened, that's when we see people move towards violence, and particularly when they can't resolve those in really that pro-social way. And of course, the other side of that is we need to understand the person. What's their resilience, their coping skills, their upbringing. All of those individual factors influence their ability to respond and resolve their sort of thwarted and threatened needs when they do arise. So while we've got that sort of overarching psychological needs aspect, we have to understand the individual as well. So that's sort of two central pieces of the puzzle.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I'm just remembering obviously the Port Arthur massacre for people of our age was fairly sort of fundamental in terms of the first time something like that had really happened in our lifetime and close to home. But I remember being one of the first things when I started reading about it, I guess probably as a teenager, that I found kind of psychologically interesting was that the shooter Martin Bryant was he kept asking how many people had died. He wanted to know the score. Like he wanted to know whether he'd got the high score or not. And it was almost like it was a game. And it was very much about that in pursuit of significance. Because he was, by all accounts, a loser. Like he was someone, and I don't mean that to denigrate people, but he was someone that didn't have much else happening in his life that gave him significance. And that was something that he was obviously chasing. And that look, we could talk about that as a whole podcast as well, like the pursuit of significance and how that influences being recruited by extremist organizations and all kinds of things as well. One of the things I just wanted to ask you about too, I read a book a few years ago called The Violence Project by James Densley and Gillian Peterson, looking predominantly at school shootings in the United States. And one of the things that I remember as a conclusion they came to is that one of the biggest risk factors for someone enacting a desire for a mass shooting was that they were actually suicidal. So it's one thing to be homicidal and to want to kill people, but it's another thing to be suicidal. And they found that suicidality was one of the largest, like big flashing red sign risk factors. Can you just talk a little bit about that risk factor and maybe that last resort thinking and how that impacts the risk?
Yeah, and I think that applies generally to targeted violence. When we look at that as a broad sort of cohort of offending, that suicidality coupled with homicidal thoughts is a huge red flag. Um, and again, it feeds into that last resort aspect, as you're saying. So, if I die, I want to take people with me. And there's also the significant aspect that's associated with that. It's interesting as well because we see that, large number of perpetrators actually end up ultimately dying when they do carry out the attack as well. So I think roughly figures sort of would say around 30 to 40% of those that carry out mass casualty attacks die from suicide at the time. And then around about 90% are suicidal in the lead up to carrying out that attack as well. So the suicidal aspect is really significant. It probably speaks to, as we were saying before, that inability to consider alternatives. The person sort of psychologically is right at the edge where they're unable to find, alternative pro-social solutions. And yes, the dials are becoming increasingly dialed up for them. And when you think about carrying out, a lone actor attack or any sort of form of targeted violence, there's a high likelihood that you could be harmed in that process. So I think we see a lot of perpetrators accept that they could die in the process of carrying out that attack, and they probably sit, quite high up on that sort of self-harm, suicidal continuum where there's that really quite fine, delicate balance between whether they will sort of carry out suicide or carry out homicide. But particularly as well from interviewing some of these folks, it's been that in itself is quite fascinating because many of them talk about harboring strong suicidal thoughts, but having the inability to go through with that. And it would be much easier to take others out with them rather than simply carry out suicide by themselves. And we could potentially sort of talk about what that might mean, psychologically for them, the sort of entitlement around that, the externalization of blame, the wanting to hold others,
and suicide by cop, right? Letting someone else make the decision for you.
wanting to hold others to account. So in some ways, it sort of allows them to go out with, it sounds terrible, but to go out with a bang and making a statement,
Yeah.
even though they are ultimately suicidal and sort of lost that regard for their own well-being.
Yeah, in fact, it's become so, I guess, quote unquote, normal for an offender to either commit suicide or to be killed by law enforcement or to essentially to force law enforcement to kill them by firing at law enforcement during the attack. That it almost seems unusual when someone doesn't end up dying as a result of the attack. So, like, I mean, I remember being really surprised that Tarrant was taken but taken into custody. That to me felt like it would be a hallmark, either commit suicide in a vehicle before the police get there or force the police to shoot. I know you've had some connection with that case, so I know you're probably limited in what you can say there, but I find it fascinating that people are willing to commit this act of violence and then spend the rest of their life in prison as a result. I guess living off infamy, but doesn't seem like a very logical choice. Just like knowing what prison's like, it's not going to be a whole lot of time to relive your glory, I guess. But is there? I guess from a risk factors point of view, and I'm dancing around the plan for the interview because there's so many things that I would like to talk to you about, and I'm sure we probably will in future times. But from a risk factor point of view, if someone is seeking counsel, whether it's from an actual psychologist, whether it's from a religious leader, whether it's just from friends, what are some of I guess the red flags where someone should be saying, I need to let the police know about this, or I need to tell someone about this because I think he's actually going to do it. And we are saying he a lot and fella a lot. It's that female mass killers are very, very, very rare. And that's probably a whole 20-minute discussion about why that is as well. But back to the first question. What are some of those red flags that maybe someone who is in confidence of the potential offender should be looking for?
I'm sure most of your listeners probably are aware of Reid Malloy's proximal warning behaviors, which I mean are just fantastic and a great guide. I mean, loosely, just stepping back from that, we're talking about intent and capability. So when we can see that there's intent developing and then the person has the capability to act on that. So again, I'll probably draw parallels to targeted violence. So we can look at that across all targeted violence offending. And then it probably becomes more specific to the particular type of area. But yes, have we seen a change in baseline behavior? So is there an increased intent, an increased preoccupation, focus on a victim or a grievance, on a particular sort of sense of being mistreated or wronged? And are they expressing an intention to seek out some sort of retribution or revenge, becoming more, I guess, tunnel visioned or focused on that issue? So the intent is developing around that. And then at the same time, are there capability enhancing factors that we're also seeing? And that would be capability enhancing factors to carry out an attack. So, becoming more skilled in weaponry, becoming more skilled in or more knowledgeable in how other attacks have previously been carried out, acquiring resources and materials that may be used in an attack. We might see some level of shift in their identity. So they're becoming more sort of identified both with their issue and with violence as well. And then we're also sort of seeing an ever narrowing list of sort of solutions for them. So that they're essentially unable to contemplate or consider alternative scenarios. More and more they're focused on violence or revenge or retribution as being the and only answer. So we basically are seeing that the walls begin to close in. So there's a lot of factors. I know that's a loose statement, but there's no concrete answer around this. It's guidelines and goalposts that we look at, but ultimately it's the intent and the capability aspect that are the enormous indicators. And of course, Reed Malloy's warning behaviors give a little bit more guidance and parameters around what specifically could be some of those factors to look for.
Yeah, look, and I think it's really important for people that are maybe general citizens or yeah, maybe in a care profession. Just to be clear, I mean, most jurisdictions now are developing some sort of fixated threat assessment center as part of their overall practice, and that's usually a combination of mental health professionals and law enforcement, where the goal 90% of the time is to get the person into treatment, not to arrest them, right? Most people that develop an unhealthy fixation actually need care and treatment more so than they need to be arrested. So it's shouldn't be feared that if I let someone know that this person's going to end up getting shot, right? Unless they're so far down the path that if someone knocks on the door, they may pull a gun on them, right? That's maybe a different thing. But then you definitely should be telling somebody. But yeah, we are evolving our understanding and our treatment of these issues literally by the day. So it's something that we probably have to look at more on a societal issue, and that probably leads me into the next couple of questions I've got for you, because I think there is a general misconception that anyone who can kill a bunch of people must be crazy. All right. So where does mental health fit into this? And are people just psychotic, or is it, well, where does it all fit together?
Yeah, it's a fascinating conversation because mental health is a part of it, but it's also not a part of it at the same time. So we've seen, plenty of cases where people have had psychotic episodes or been personality disordered. We've seen cases of autism spectrum disorder that have been prevalent amongst offenders. But at the same time, there's also an absence in many cases. So research would say that probably somewhere between roughly 20 to 50% of lone actors have some form of mental disorder or mental health diagnoses. But of course, that leaves, a large cohort that don't. And then that becomes really tricky as well. So, you know, is it the mental health that's driving the violence, or as they move up that pathway towards violence, does their mental health deteriorate? So the actual, the true cause and what sort of the primary catalyst becomes really tricky to differentiate. We certainly know that there's a significant shift in thinking and coping and emotions. Um, I guess as was touched on before, as that suicidality and some of those things do increase for quite a few individuals, there's that greater sort of sense of hopelessness. There's a sense of despair, but then that can be combated by having sort of a mission or quest that they're focused on, which suddenly then orients that more towards then suddenly having a brief purpose or sense of meaning and significance within their life. So we get fluctuations across that. Some of the diagnoses that probably are more common, as you sort of touched on, are schizophrenia, delusional disorders, yeah, autism spectrum disorder, um, and then of course our personality disorders, narcissistic personality, where we see that entitlement, that grandiosity. And we do also see schizotypal personality come through as well, which is sort of an unusual type of presentation where individuals have a little bit of a disturbance in how they see the world. They have trouble relating to others. They might have some odd, bizarre, and unusual types of thoughts. So they're not of an unsound mind, but they do sort of lean a little bit more towards the odd and unusual type of presentation. But they're certainly not schizophrenic in that classical sense. It's more a personality type of disposition where they have sort of odd, unusual, and maybe bizarre type of thoughts and thinking patterns and trouble relating to others. Um, and then the other thing that's really interesting as well is we see a whole bunch of sort of subclinical types of traits and presentations. And I would probably say some of the things that come through are things like shame, envy, a strong sort of hatred of others, and also this sort of deep-seated hatred of oneself as well. And that again probably feeds into the suicidality that we've spoken about. But there's some really strong subclinical stuff that's there where it may not be at the diagnostic level, but at the trait level, we can see some strong traits that do emerge.
One of the things I've always been curious about is for people that attach themselves to an ideology that they then go on to commit an act of violence in the name of that particular ideology. Like, what percentage found the ideology first and then decided to act upon violence, and what percentage were always going to commit an act of violence, but the ideology gave them an excuse, a way to save face and say, I'm doing this for the kingdom or for the whatever, right? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like in terms of like chicken or egg, I guess, in that sense?
I think at the moment we see the ideology will often sort of come later now. I don't want to say young individuals now, but we certainly let's talk about it, say in the prevention space, the ones that maybe we're having greater prevention efforts put in place. That's certainly a younger cohort that struggling in their own lives. They might be being bullied, they're struggling to form friendships, social connections, that they're not aggrieved per se, but they are psychologically, emotionally, socially struggling. So there's a sense of sort of injustice, a sense of being victimized, and then they lean in towards the online space and they spend hours on that, and then they come across others or very powerful narratives and media and content, and then they adopt some of these beliefs. It provides some sort of answers to their problems. It gives them some sort of sense of identity, purpose, significance. It makes them feel as though they matter and they're able to influence something or have a sort of cause or direction to pursue. And and then before they sort of realize it, they are on that pathway to violence. And I would say that that's a very strong common presentation that many police forces are dealing with from a prevention point of view. Um, so I think that's probably emerged. And then, as I guess in some older individuals, folks in their 20s and 30s, then it becomes a little bit more harder to dissect. So, is it issues in their lives and grievances coupled then with discovering the ideology? Yes, in some cases. And then sometimes, as we said earlier, it's the ideology which then perpetuates other life problems and isolates them from friends and family, and they get further down that path and removed. And yeah, and then that becomes a cycle. So it is really difficult, but I think the younger cohort, there's probably a reasonable pattern there around that.
Yeah, going back a few years now, I was doing a research project on some of the psychological tools utilized by terrorism recruiters and or terrorist organization recruiters, I should say. And it was very apparent that there was a deliberate effort to target vulnerable young people, people that felt excluded, they felt marginalized, they felt mistreated, usually at the time when they felt the most rejected. So that there's one organization in the UK that even had Google alerts set up, or essentially an alert set up in a an online forum for Arabic speaking youth where it would if someone mentioned the word breakup or fired or like that they'd obviously just had a destruction of a relationship or some sort of damage to their self-worth, they'd get an alert and then one of the recruiters would slip in there and say, oh, I'm really sorry that happened to you, bro, and like try to build a friendship, which then led to let me introduce you to my friends. And it wasn't like, have you considered blowing stuff up? It was like just a support network that came in at a time when the person was feeling vulnerable and down. It is really kind of it's gross to think about from an outside point of view, but it's genius, right? And you could argue that a lot of our military recruiters have done very similar stuff. You try to get someone into a cause, you get them at a time when they feel like they don't have anything going on. But look, one of the things that you just touched on there that I'd really like to spend a little bit of time on with the time we've got left, social isolation, the internet, social media. We are completely in uncharted territory as a species with the ability to control our own flow of information and the viewpoints that we're exposed to like never before. 20 years ago, if you wanted to be and exist like just exist in humanity without being a hermit, you had to interact with people you disagreed with. Now we don't, right? Now we can. COVID showed us we can live somewhat normal lives without ever really interacting with people outside our house if we don't want to. And some people, funnily enough, some of the people that railed against the restrictions are still living inside their basements. It's interesting to me the role that isolation has had on, I guess, my perception of that as a growing problem that people are now just stuck in this echo chamber of their own beliefs and losing the ability to be able to converse intelligently with someone who disagrees with them and potentially change that. And restrictions aside, I think in pretty much every society that I'm aware of, people are interacting less in person now than they were in 2019. Right? It's just we do more stuff online. We're doing this interview online. You and I, whenever we talk week to week, it's online. Right? It's great that we can do that, but it's it is an interesting dynamic. So, what role has that played from your perspective?
Oh, it's enormous, and I don't know how we'll ever measure it. I think we're in a more divisive society now than we have been for a long time. Um, and the flip side of that as well is that, as you're pointing out, that when people go online, that division is just paramount. It's obvious because it's salient and it works for algorithms. And then you look on it and you click at it, and then it's pops up again. And the algorithm gives you more of what you've previously looked at. And as we know, you then end up in an echo chamber where that is all you're seeing. You're getting more and more content that is that way, and then it becomes, the more you click on it, the more it's reinforced. So it is really tricky. And coupling that, if you don't have, in some ways, a strong sense of identity, if you're struggling yourself, you're not confident in who you are, um, maybe you've had various setbacks and vulnerabilities recently. You could be younger in age as well. There's various vulnerabilities that people have that then make them susceptible to being influenced by that material. So if you don't have a strong psychological foundation, which is the best way to put it, then it's easy to adopt the ideas and views of others and be influenced by that. And even as a, generally rational individuals, all of us are susceptible to seeing media headlines and taking those on and believing them, and we then later find out, of course, that they're not true. So it is so tricky. We're probably in an information wars sort of era now where we don't know what is and isn't true. And it's the stuff that's the loudest and at the various extremes that tends to capture people's attention. Um, and at the same time, as you mentioned before, social relationships or face-to-face contact is probably on the decline. Um, we are going to see a whole generation of youths that grow up now that have grown up being predominantly raised on the internet, very different social dynamics, and what the implication of that will be is very hard to say. One of the things that is interesting, though, is in sort of what we have looked at with lone actors is that it's not as though they necessarily lack social connections. And I think this does probably tie into maybe the age of the internet as well. But it's the social reciprocity that they get out of social interactions that's lacking. So they have social connections, but like many other people, they don't get the same value. So, most of us enjoy our social relationships. We get connections, we get meaning, we get purpose, we might get energy, we get ideas, and all those sorts of things that give us meaning through our social relationships. But a lot of the lone actor folks don't take the same value out of relationships that we do. So they just don't get fulfillment and enjoyment out of it. It's a bit of an empty process for them. And so they then sort of pursue their own ways of finding meaning. Um, but the social connection just doesn't hold the same value for them.
Is that in any way connected to sociopathy or psychopathy, like in terms of just the not feeling the human relationship aspect?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I did my PhD back in the day on psychopathy, and I think even though psychopathy is very prevalent amongst a lot of violent offending, I actually think across the lone actor space, we're not seeing a large number of individuals that are actually psychopathic. There's a whole bunch of other sort of different presentations as we just spoke about. So, but there certainly is an element there where the social aspect is significant for these folks, and the ability to solve social problems is lacking, um, but not in the psychopathic sense, in more of I guess, a lack of resilience, lack of sort of social and emotional intelligence capacity, coupled with probably elements of entitlement. And then along with that, we see probably a contagion like effect at times that goes on with mass violence, where like we know with suicide, that the more people see it, the higher the rates end up being. So I do think there's a bit of a subculture aspect going on as well now, where years ago, if people had problems, yes, they would maybe go out and act violently, but they certainly wouldn't go out and carry out a mass casualty event. So in some ways, it is a bit of a symptom of the time and the culture with where we're at. So now if things are going wrong in your life, people want to seek sort of widespread revenge and make a significant statement. Um, you know, Serial offending, for example, has declined. Um, I think the stats would probably suggest as well, sexual homicide offending and some of those other serious forms of violence has also declined. But the flip side is these types of incidents are, staying quite highly common and prevalent and frequent. So we do see that I think there is a cultural impact here where uh, violence is now being expressed this way.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about. Just the almost the social the culture of violence or the social culture of trending violence or something along those lines would be that's a whole new thing I hadn't thought about. That's quite interesting. Um, I think on that, so as we're coming up on time, I think it's important. We've spoken a lot about doom and gloom and the warning signs and motivations, but what are some things we should be doing, I guess, and I say we, I mean society, law enforcement. Like what are some things we can be doing to actually prevent lone act of violence, these mass casualty attacks?
Well, it's a big question, Joe. We could probably talk for another hour on that. But there's two pieces, isn't there? There's the identification and detection piece. How that happens and how we make sure that we're doing that effectively. And that is, yeah, it starts from information flow, then goes through to probably threat assessment. Um, and then, of course, it's the response that results from that threat assessment. I mean, probably there's a range of different assessment approaches, and it's not probably worth sort of unpacking those, but the your assessment tools are only going to be as effective as your processes. So I think we make a big deal about, do we have the right assessment tool? Which is great. You need to have a good assessment tool that's validated, but you then need to have good processes in place to deal with that. Because if you've got a great tool but rubbish processes, the system will fall down and gaps will emerge, and yeah, we'll miss crucial things and to try and prevent that or intervene at an early stage. And Rick Shaw, who some of you may know, has done some good work around this, really talking about the silos that can happen, the gaps and
Yep.
disconnects as well.
I was actually just gonna reference Rick because I had him on the podcast a couple of years ago, and I was really impressed with the mapping of information that he's able to do. Yeah, I was unfortunately post incident, but just to see where all the information was, that if it had just been shared, it would have created a much better picture that could have been acted upon. But it very much goes into what you're talking about there with the information sharing, silo busting, and finding a central portal for that information to be collated and reviewed.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we need to move more and more towards that. The approach he's talked about, where we see information essentially funneled into programs and then it goes to the right people that are able to respond, is, yeah, it's a fantastic way to look at things. Um, and if various communities can adopt that approach, that's really useful and effective. So yeah, the information flow is crucial. But then of course the assessment piece and the response piece as well. And then we get to, once we've done all that, what the hell does that mean for prevention? And the prevention piece is enormous. And that can be prevention from sort of at a society and government level, to the individual level, to how do we tailor things to an individual. So one of the things I think is really fascinating. So I came across, as I was writing my book on this issue, this thing called the hero's journey, which which is really sort of, I guess, unusual in some ways, and it goes all the way back to Joseph Campbell's term that he coined back in 1949 around the hero's journey, which is really this idea that we all have sort of this central pursuit in life where we can adopt the position of a hero, and step our way through life, hopefully eventually sort of coming out the other side of struggles and setbacks and adversity, and get to a point where we feel like we've had some level of triumph. And when we look at a lot of lone actor folks, they are on a quest, they're on a mission, they perceive themselves as a warrior like individual. And so, in some ways, we could argue that it's a really dysfunctional pursuit of the hero's journey. It's when it goes off track and goes sideways, and they're trying to pursue some sort of outcome, something which is a quest where they feel as though they are, going to achieve something, have significance, have meaning, but it's completely dysfunctional. And so that becomes really interesting then when we think about that from a prevention point of view. So if we can see that people are naturally drawn towards this idea of sort of pursuing the hero's journey, then that becomes great from an intervention and prevention point of view. So that would be, how do we reshape that in a pro-social way, to get them perceiving that they actually have their own internal capabilities to step through this, and rather than viewing setbacks and challenges as threats, look at them as opportunities for resilience, opportunities to grow as individuals and to overcome that. And so just sort of focusing on the hero's journey just a little bit more for a minute. So we know that there's some really good outcomes around that, so that essentially we can re-script people's uh, perceptions and narratives that they have of their life. And those that do sort of view their life more as a hero's journey have greater meaning, they have greater psychological well-being, they're more happy. But simply by going through the process of scripting out your story, but reframing it through the lens of the hero's journey, where we're seeing all these struggles as actually things that are going to build our character, I think that is something that has a lot of promise for the future. And we're only very early days with that, but it gives me excitement around where we could take that. And imagine if we built that into schools where we're giving people early on that way of looking at life and looking at problems and giving them those capabilities to solve setbacks and challenges and to be able to think their way through that so that we can front end that rather than wait till they've got problems and then we'll suddenly go, oh, now try and think your way out of it. Let's give them the skills early on so that they have the
Mm.
psychological capacity to solve issues and reframe them when they happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea. The hero's journey is really powerful. One of the things that I think it went viral because Joe Rogan said it. But it was the idea of like looking at your life from your starting position right now, like you are the hero of a movie, and like this, wherever you are right now is where the movie starts. So what is that journey to over the next 2.5 hours of cinema to get you to what would be a good movie, right? What would be a good outcome, and you triumph. So it doesn't matter what position you're in right now, like that's the starting position. So what do you need to do to get to the next stage? The Another tool that I've used and similar in some ways to what you just said, just to help people that feel stuck is saying, who do you want to be in 10 years time, right? And get them to really flesh out exactly who that person is. What do they do? How do they think? What sort of relationships do they have? Like whatever it is, and you don't 10 years is just a nominal figure. You can make it longer if you want. And then say, okay, so once you really know that person, what would that person do right now? Like, what would that person do if they were in your shoes? Right. And then because it's you, right? It's the idealized you. So what would they do about your current situation? And sometimes that just provides a different lens rather than, it's almost like role modeling, but with yourself as opposed to another person. So kind of interesting, but yeah, I like what you just said there. Tell us a little bit about your book, about what you're working on, and what we can expect.
Well, I'm on to the second rewrite.
I'll say
Who would
only
have
only
thought?
five more to go.
Yeah, I was going to say, who would have thought that the rewriting stage is nearly more painful than the actual initial writing stage? But I've been optimistic. I'm trying to take a very broad view of the lone actor and mass casualty issue. So essentially, starting out by looking at how did we get here as a society? What has gone wrong for this to become such a significant issue that we're now facing? And then sort of moving from there, looking at the perpetrators and the various degrees of motivation and factors that often are driving the violence. And then hopefully bringing it all together by talking about how we try and solve this and get our way out of this issue, which of course is complex. And but there are lots of options. I do at times I get a little concerned by the fact that we try to control our way out of this by placing greater restrictions on people. Um, and that often happens at a government level. And that in itself often can create greater problems. So that certainly gives me, I think, time to pause and sometimes wonder how we get the balance between what individuals need versus the governmental or societal responses to this. And that's a really tricky conversation because sometimes governments just act and don't consider the sort of flow-on effect of that. So sometimes we can create other lone actors by the responses and the infringement on people's freedoms. So before we know it, we've done one thing and it's caused a chain reaction, which has resulted in another thing. So that I think that's a really essential conversation that we need to be having more of. And I don't think it's happening at the moment. So we really need to strike that balance between how do we get this great cycle where we put strategies in place, but then there's ultimately a feedback and refinement process around that, rather than it being more so just a sort of governmental political response, which really we don't actually then have any idea, unless you're at the grassroots level, about whether that's actually creating change. And many times those at the grassroots level will say it's not actually helping the cause.
Yeah, yeah, well said. So with your book, is this going to be more of an academic work? Is it going to be a practitioner's handbook? Is it going to be pop psych? Like, where are you pitching it in terms of your audience?
Well, I'm trying to make it not too academic, so it's that's
And you are a well-published academic, so you can do that.
the rewrites are the softening of it at the moment, to
Okay,
try and make it sort of more readable and more approachable. So yeah, look, hopefully it will be sort of not pop psychology, but yeah, I guess more sort of non-fiction with a psych leaning, but yeah, heavily case-based as well, because we
okay.
have so much learning that we can take out of cases. So yeah, the aim is for each sort of chapter to start it off with a case, and then talk about the issues that are in that case, and yeah, keep that model going throughout the book to hopefully give some rich illustrations around all those sort of different aspects that I've just touched on.
So a little bit closer to Gift of Fear than the Handbook of Threat Assessment.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right. Cool. Cool.
And
All
I was just going to quickly say also, I'm just working on one other paper at the moment as well, with forensic linguist Julia Cooper, who's over in LA, and also former detective Rob Thomas, who interviewed Alec Minassian, who is
okay.
a well-known incel
Hmm.
fellow over in Canada. So we're looking at proposing some sort of guidelines and recommendations around how we go about both at a police level and at a correctional level about interviewing these folks. So
Mm.
there's actually been a lot discussed around what's the best approach to take to trying to engage these fellows. And we know so many die through suicide, but we really need to get out and start talking to these individuals to understand them. And of course, that means that we also need to have a good approach to how we do that as well.
Yeah, fascinating. Look forward to reading that when it's ready as well. Uh, Nathan, I really appreciate you taking the time. Take it as you'd be surprised how hard it is to actually coordinate time zones when it's only 2 hours difference. I can do US and UK no problem. It's just early morning or late evening, but trying to get both of us when we work at relatively similar times is actually deceptively difficult. But I appreciate that. It's always a good time talking to you. Any final thoughts or parting words for our listeners before we sign off?
No, look, it's been great to chat. It's nice to finally be able to get together and to record the episode. And yeah, I mean the podcast is wonderful, Joe. So I appreciate you doing it. And I know sometimes there's a lot of work to get the podcast just to keep the momentum going. So yeah, I appreciate you doing that, and it gives us, it's a great resource to all those across the area. So yeah, hopefully you have many more episodes to come.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, mate. It only happens because of great guests like yourself. So thank you and all the best. I'll let you go enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Joe.
All right. Bye bye.